then we know that the distance is what is changing. And because we know the speed of light is fixed, it doesn't change. So if your time changes, then your distance is what changes. And we got some gas measurements, which were quite useful because we also saw for the first time since I've been here sulfur dioxide in the emissions, which we knew should have been there, but we weren't seeing. And we suspected that it was a function of the groundwater interacting with the sulfur dioxide and hiding it from us. So what we think is happening is that there's less groundwater now to interact with the sulfur dioxide. So we're actually seeing it. So we think the hydrothermal system is actually drying out.
And what is the implication of that?
Well, in terms of monitoring, it's in terms of what the volcano is doing, it doesn't change what the volcano is doing because this is a shallow process. But in terms of monitoring, it gives us another tool to monitor. If we can monitor the SO2 flux, I think it's much more useful than no SO2 flux. And it also is a technique that does not require you to go onto the crater rim. So it's not as dangerous as the multi-gas technique, which we're currently employing now, where we need to get close. So it's safer for the person who's doing it, and it's also an added tool to our complement of monitoring techniques.
Okay, so there was some news I know today that Ms. Forbes was being inundated with telephone calls from people saying that there has been increased activity at the volcano. Can you shed some light on that and calm the fears of people somewhat?
Well, from the data streams we've been getting, because we can look at the seismometers here in real time, and we can look at the cameras in real time that we've got on the crater. We have not seen any evidence of such an increase. I think what people might have noticed would have been maybe what they perceive to be excessive degassing. But the degassing you see is a function of the weather conditions. So if there's a lot more moisture or water vapor in the atmosphere, you may see a much thicker plume than you would if it was a drier atmosphere. And today was a fairly wet day, I think. So I think what they would have seen is the interaction of the gas plume with the atmospheric water, which created a bit more of a steamy type cloud and not so much a function of the volcano giving trouble.
Okay, thank you. There you have it, folks. No increased activity at La Soufriere Volcano over the last week or so. Michelle Forbes, we had a conversation last week when we did a program eyeing La Soufriere. What type of work has N.E.M.O been engaged in since our last conversation?
Thank you, Theresa. We have been engaging in activities, ongoing activities, especially in the public education area, and meeting regionally with our key partners. So we continue with our what we call our drive-throughs through the communities. We're still on the windward side in the orange zone, just entering the red orange zone. So today we're going up into, hopefully get down into Connery and Park Hill this evening. So we're on the road with our public address systems, stopping at strategic points and informing persons of, tell them what is happening at the volcano, which area they're in, what they can expect in the event of an explosive eruption, and of course, what we expect them to do, what action they will take once an evacuation order is given. So we can't with the Seismic Research Center, have our public service announcements on radio stations. We work with our graphics team internally, regionally, in having some of our ads and our graphics to some of our public service announcements out. And we continue level to plan work with the police, in particular on the evacuation planning, and visit the sites that we'll be using as staging areas, Barley and out of those playing fields in the event that we need to activate or have a command communities. We continue to meet locally with the various subcommittees. Last week we would have had a bit of a is with over 60 persons, many of our subcommittees within the national structure and all of the government agencies looking at our plan will be their action, because each ministry, each department has to have their own plan in the event of an explosive eruption, or as we plan for the volcano or we plan for emergencies. Everyone has to have their plan going forward on what they're going to do. So it's a lot of things happening behind the scenes. We have met with regional partners in terms of looking at our needs, our stock levels in terms of release supplies, where we need to fill the gaps, if any. And we continue to work daily with all of our key agencies to ensure plans are in place, and in the event that we need to step it up a bit, we can do so.
So we'll talk a little bit more about the national plan. But at this time, you did mention evacuation. No evacuation order has been given as of today. But in the event that one does happen, the Commissioner of Police is the person who is charged with the responsibility of planning and organizing and implementing that process. Talk to us about that work, Commissioner John.
Sorry, I didn't.
You didn't unmute.
Yes. I'm saying that first of all, we have been working along with N.E.M.O and the National Disaster Management Plan. We have had several meetings with the various communities in the red zone on the leeward side and on the windward side. As a body, we have we're in the process of formulating a plan for the police as well. We're in the final stage of it. We are in consultation with the villagers. We are looking at the vulnerable persons in the area. In the areas, we are also looking at the number of vehicles, let's say in Fancy or in Richmond, Chateaubelair area. In consultation with persons there, we are inquiring of them how many of them would be willing to assist in the evacuation, and how that gives us an idea as to how much vehicles we would need. We are looking at alternative routes to get out of these red areas. We are also in consultation with the Forestry Department or the Ministry of Agriculture to look at places to house animal and the evacuation plan as regard animals and how they would be, where would they be placed, because persons would not want to leave their property or their animals unprotected. So these are things that we have to consider as well. We are looking at areas outside of the red zone to relocate stations, police stations, in the event that the red zone adversely affected. We had a consultation today with membership of the organization, and the let's say Georgetown and Fancy, they are in the red zone, but Fancy might be more impacted than Georgetown. So we will have to have consultation with N.E.M.O. Well, we're hoping that it doesn't happen, but we're preparing for the worst case scenario. Despite that Georgetown might be in the red zone, they might be less affected, so persons may still be able to operate from N.E.M.O, but that would be based on the advice from the scientists and based on additional information. But the police, we are very much on the ball as regards this, and we are taking the clue from N.E.M.O, we are taking guidance from the scientists, and we're really thankful to the communities for supporting us and for working along with the police in this endeavor.
So, Commissioner, at the internal level, do you have a special committee that has been tasked with the responsibility of dealing with this area?
Yes, we have a special committee that is headed by the Assistant Commissioner in charge of operation. It also includes the divisional commanders in the red zone and persons with special expertise in these areas, like the person in charge of SSU, some members of the Coast Guard who have knowledge as to these things. Persons from some members of the organization, they were deployed with RSS, set to Montserrat, and they would have knowledge about this type of activity. I also spoke to the Commissioner of Police from Montserrat. He sent a document to me as regard their operation plan. So we are looking into that as well.
Okay. Thank you. When we come back, Ms. Forbes, we're going to talk a little bit more about the national plan and also about the need for individuals and families to have their own plan or to think about getting their own plan in place. We'll pause for some messages and we'll be back in just a moment.
Fire and dice. Together on one scratch ticket can make your dreams come true. Yes, it's Fire and Dice. The new $10 scratch game with thousands of dollars to be won. Match your numbers with any of the winning numbers and win the prize shown up to $125,000. You can double or triple your prize with Fire and Dice. Available from all lotto agents and runners. There's cash to catch with just a scratch.
Welcome back. And Michelle, one of the things I wanted to do, which probably should have been done in the beginning, is for Dr. Chris to introduce himself formally to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, because, you know, he just took over from Dr. Robertson and we don't know much about him. So, Dr. Chris, can you tell us a little bit more about you and your own work in this area before we go back to Michelle Forbes?
All right. I'm originally from Montserrat, and basically the eruption in Montserrat made me become what I am. Now, volcanologists come in all different types, and I'm the type who specializes in volcanic gases, magma chemistry, and petrology. So most of my work is focused on the plumbing system of the actual volcano and not so much of the activity at the surface. So basically what would have happened is when this volcano started erupting in Montserrat, I got interested. I volunteered to work at the observatory. Then I more or less like focused on this aspect because that is the aspect of volcanism which really did something for me, which is the geochemical monitoring of volcanic systems. Then I I went to UWI, did a first degree in 97. Then after that, I went to England and did a postgraduate studies in England, and then came back to Montserrat in 2006 and started working there as the degassing scientist. But as I said, my PhD was in petrology as well, so I actually do both degassing and petrology. So one of the things which people would have noticed happening here is that we sampled that dome. We sampled rocks from the dome. And those dome rocks would actually complement the degassing studies that we're doing here. The information that we get from them would complement that. So that is the kind of thing I do as a scientist. Look at the gas chemistry, the gas fluxes, the magma chemistry, the mineral chemistry, and the textures of the rocks. And basically what I should be able to do, if all goes well, is tell you things like how deep your magma chamber is, how hot it is, how much water there is in it. I could tell you things about how deep your degassing is occurring. You know, if there's mixing happening in your reservoir, you know, magma chamber processes is what I really specialize in, and not surface activity. So that's why I keep measuring gas since I've been here.
Okay, any similarities with La Soufriere Montserrat and La Soufriere St. Vincent?
Yeah, they're very different systems, and it's probably closer to this volcano that you have is probably closer to the one I worked on for my PhD, which is Mount Etna in Sicily, in Italy. But because the scientific staff at the UWI-SRC staff, we would have done work, or me personally would have done work on this volcano in the past. And the last time I came here was 2018, where I took some gas measurements from in that crater. So I have sort of a baseline to compare the measurements I'm taking now to. I would have done work in Dominica and St. Lucia as well, because those islands would have fumarolic fields where I can apply the multigas technique and try and develop baselines for these sleeping volcanoes. But the idea is if I can get the chemistry of them when they're not doing something, I should be able to see if they're coming alive, for want of a better phrase, from changes in the chemistry or the chemical composition of the plumes, which I've been trying to do. So I've been working on this volcano in the past, but it's not the same as Montserrat's volcano. It's slightly different. The magmas in Montserrat are a bit stickier. They're more viscous, and the domes tend to grow a lot bigger instead of more pancake-like domes that you get here. But that has to do with how sticky the lavas are. And then in terms of the degassing regime, the gases are coming up slightly different to Montserrat. Here you've got one lava being erupted. In Montserrat, we've got two. So there's subtle differences, but differences that we can wrap our heads around and adjust for this system and monitor it properly.
Okay, thanks for that. And I know that you have taken some samples. How soon can we expect to get some results from those samples that have been taken?
Well, I'm pleased to say that the samples have arrived to the individuals who they were sent to. The word I got, maybe by next week, they should have some data back. And basically what they're doing is they're looking at the bulk rock geochemistry. And what they do is they crush the entire rock and make it into a powder and look at the major elements and the trace elements. But they also slice that rock into some really thin slices and look at it under a microscope and look at the mineral composition. So one of the things we want to do is to compare it to the most recent eruption, which is 1979, to see how similar it is to that, or if it's even the same material that's coming out. Because that tells us a lot about what to expect, if it's fresh material or if it's old material that's just oozing out. There's a big difference in terms of what is to come. So that's one of the things we want to figure out, you know, where is this material coming from? Is it old material that's been sitting there and just got squeezed out for whatever reason? Or is it new, fresh material that's coming from depth? I mean, there is some circumstantial evidence that may lean towards one or the other, but we need more answers to be sure and concrete as to what is it we're dealing with. And that
what
would
would make
affect.
a difference if it's old or if it's new?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. You would expect a new, fresher magma to have a more explosive component to it than old material which has sat there in the gas for 40 years, because we know gases drive eruptions. So if it's fresh and full of gas, then the potential for explosive activity is greater than if it wasn't fresh material. But that does not mean you can't have that sort of activity in both scenarios, but it just reduces the potential if it's older material, but it doesn't rule it out.
Okay. Thank you. And by the way, Dr. Clarence Band sends her regards. Michelle, let's talk a little bit about the national plan. What are the main elements of that plan?
Okay, the main elements of the plan are really looking at the different stages leading up to a possible eruption or explosive eruption. At first, in the plan, we have all the preamble, the volcanic hazard zones, the communities that are in these zones, the populations also that is in these zones, so that can guide us in terms of our planning and who do we need to cater for in our plan. A big component of the plan is a community aspect, the community-driven part, where we have been working with the communities over quite a bit of years in terms of getting them to a state of readiness in the event of an explosive eruption. What we have done now, this plan has been in existence since about 2005, and we have done work on it over the years. We had it in 2005, then we updated it in 2014 because that is around the same time that we actually made some sort of changes to the volcano hazard map. If you have been studying the map over the last few years, we would have seen Fancy that was in the orange zone and Georgetown was not in the red zone. And those changes that we actually requested it from the scientists to ensure that we do not leave anyone behind in terms of Fancy, the furthest community in the northeast, so that we don't leave anyone behind in event of an evacuation, and to include Georgetown because the scientists would have been studying Soufriere and other volcanoes in the region and around the world and realized that you can have pyroclastic flows to a certain extent. So we'd have made those adjustments to the plan. What we have done now, especially since the advent of the ongoing effusive eruption, is to really tidy up the standard operating procedures. When you hear us say the SOPs, and this is really where you, at a snapshot, any agency that has a part or role to play within the national system can look and see what is my role at different stages of the plan. So we have the pre-eruption, explosive eruption phase, where we have the prevent or pre-evacuation stage. This is what we need to be doing all now, that we are doing now, from the public education, ensuring that we continue our meetings and get the committees ready. That's at the pre-evacuation stage, evacuation planning, liaison with our key agencies nationally and regionally, ensure that persons that have the information that they need to have, because we recognize that even though we have been doing the work over the years, persons may not have been paying attention. Only now that we hear the volcano is erupting, then you have persons paying a little bit more attention, ensuring that we have been continuing to liaison with the Seismic Research Center over the years in all of our programs around volcanic hazards, geological hazards, and also to ensure that our key agencies understand what is in the plan. The second component of the plan is how do we go about giving the evacuation order? What alerts are going to be given? Who gives the evacuation order? And if the evacuation order is only given after we have had that discussion with the scientists will guide us. Scientists like Dr. Christopher will guide us as to what is happening and what we can expect, so that we now, as a government entity, can actually make recommendations and determine whether or not we are going to issue an evacuation order based on what the scientists are seeing are happening at the volcano. So then you have the evacuation order part of it. And once we give that evacuation order, that's when the police and all the systems kick in. And it is done, the information is done simultaneously. So we want to ensure that all agencies know what their role and function is within each component of the plan. And the evacuation component is quite large, because from the time that order is given, everybody has to kick into place. What we have done also is look at the different scenarios in terms of the time that an event may happen. So because evacuating during the day is completely different from evacuating in the night. The resources that you need in the night will be a little different. In event you have evacuation night, you need more lights, it will be slower, people are a bit more cautious, you may not be able to see exactly where you're going in the night. So we have those scenarios at all the time: evacuation in the night, evacuation during the day. We look at the different worst case scenarios in the plan, and we have adjusted our standard operating procedures to suit also. Whether you have a no warning, if you want to say no warning explosive eruption, and you have an eruption without little or no warning that an explosive eruption has happened, or so we look at that scenario. So we look at a scenario where you may have a little time, not a lot of time, because that's Soufriere volcano that can move from doing nothing much to, as I keep saying, from nothing much to being quite ready to go off, if you want to put it that way, within a 24 to 48 hour period. So we look at the different scenarios, whether we have enough time to give persons a warning to get out, whether we don't have any time at all, and those are different scenarios, and how we are going to work together as agencies during all those scenarios, so all the possibilities. So you look at the sudden eruption, which means no warning, if it happens in the day versus if it happens in the night. An eruption where you have warning, what will you do in the day, what will you do in the night? And also to focus on the individual responsibility. And I know we're talking about plans, we're looking at the national level here, but we always have to drive home there's an individual responsibility for planning for emergencies for every citizen, every resident in St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
And we'll talk some more about the individual responsibility, but in the meantime, just want to remind our viewers that you can ask your questions on our Facebook page, or you can do so via YouTube. But I have our first question. Alwyn Leacock wants to know, what does the gas sampling and rock sampling contribute to in terms of predicting an eruption and planning safe evacuation? So I think that's Dr. Chris's.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think the gas sampling is a lot more useful because it's more real time. As I mentioned, we had to send the rocks overseas and get them into a lab, get them analyzed, and we're still waiting on the data. We sampled those rocks on the 16th of January, so that's a bit more than 2 weeks now, and we still don't have any sort of concrete information as to what's in them yet. That will come. However, the gassing studies, they're normally real time in most cases, whether we're using remote sensing or direct sampling, and that is much more useful for predicting eruptions. Now, as the question was asked before, how different this volcano is to the one in Montserrat, you need to know how your system behaves and how to use your gas data. So for instance, in Montserrat, the sulfur dioxide flux that we are seeing is not really indicative of the magma extrusion rate. And that's simply because the magma that's coming out, or the lava that's coming out at the surface, that is not where the gas is coming from. It's coming from a deeper one, which we don't see much of. So what we use in Montserrat to have an idea of your extrusion rate is your sulfur dioxide and HCl ratio, because as I probably mentioned in one of these briefings or updates a few days ago, HCl comes out really shallow. So if you look at that ratio, you can tell how fast your magma is coming out past your 2 kilometer depth, how fast it's coming out shallow. For this volcano, I think the sulfur dioxide flux, because the basaltic andesite which you have here is properly mixed, so you don't have two different compositions, you have one. And I'm fairly certain that the sulfur dioxide flux, if we can get it measured, would be indicative of how much lava that's coming out at the top of this volcano. So I think for this eruption and for this volcano, this sulfur dioxide flux would be a very useful tool in predicting what your volcano is doing. Because if you really think about it, when your magma is coming out slow, that's a good thing. If it start coming out fast, then you're exposing more gas to the surface much more rapidly, and then your potential for an explosion increases. So I think certain systems and certain gas measurements can be quite useful, but you need to make sure that you understand what your system is doing and which of your gas measurements to use to answer the questions that you're trying to answer.
Thank you, Doc. Commissioner, there's a comment. I think this one is for you. Someone is saying, to have the police commissioner coordinate an evacuation of citizens is a logistic blunder. The police commissioner would be far too busy with security and safety issues. This is madness. The fact that the commissioner, I don't know what that word is, but refuses to defer that to someone else shows that he does not even recognize the magnitude of his current portfolio. This should be designated to someone else, in particular, a junior commissioner rank or a civilian trained in logistics, of course. And the person goes on to say, of course, you will not sit innocently at these meetings, but offer your opinion, but not to be in charge. Your comments, your response to that, Commissioner?
Well, as Commissioner, I am in charge of evacuation, but there is a committee in place that is headed by the Assistant Commissioner in charge of operation. So they would do more of the heavy lifting. I, as Commissioner, would have to supervise and make sure that things are in place. But there are persons who would be doing the actual work. There are divisional commanders who would be given specific tasks or who have been given specific tasks as regard different areas of the country. So I don't think it's something that I cannot handle as Commissioner, and I would be overwhelmed by the fact that I have other duties to do because I can delegate to other persons.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll take another break, and when we come back, we are going to ask, I don't know who would take this question. Someone wants to know, and what are we to do in the interim? But more when we come back after this short break.
Channel 114. Visitry. Channel 114.
Welcome back. And of course, we are keeping on the trail of La Soufriere Volcano. Today, we are talking to scientist Dr. Thomas Christopher, Dr. TC. We also have with us the Commissioner of Police, Colin John, who is in charge of the evacuation process, should an evacuation order be issued. And we have the Director of N.E.M.O, Michelle Forbes. And someone was asking, and I think maybe this is for the scientists, what do we do in the interim?
Sorry, is that question for me?
I think so.
Well, basically, how we go about monitoring volcanoes is we try and gather as much data as possible. Currently, the volcano is not posing a threat to the communities which are close or closest to the volcano, and that's a function of the fact that the crater is actually containing the hazard from the dome right now. If for some reason that dome would start becoming a threat, I hope that we would be in a position to say we would affect and when. Also the same for explosions, although explosions are a bit more tricky because you could have explosions which are triggered from shallow interaction of water. And if they're not driven from depth, they're harder to see. So it's not, well, I would say it's not an exact science, but we're trying to build up as much baselines as we can for what's happening now. And hopefully if there's a change, if there's an increase in anything which we consider significant, we should be able to give the authorities enough warning so they can take the necessary action to do what it is that they do in terms of either moving the public or alerting the public, or whatever steps would be necessary given what we think may be happening at the time. So I guess right now the best thing is to do like I do, because I'm really hoping that this eruption stops and the volcano goes back to sleep. But that's just hope. But we have to hope for the best and plan for the worst, I think, as the commissioner said. So we will keep monitoring it, but we hope that it stops and goes away.
Okay, there's another question for you, Doctor. Based on the data released on dome growth today, is it safe to say that the extrusion rate has increased slightly? On the 27th January, the data showed dome volume of 4.45 million cubic meters, and on 1st October, 5.93 million cubic meters. But maybe that person actually means 1st of February?
Yeah, that's when we made the most recent observation, which was Monday. That is a true observation. It's actually a valid one. But what I could tell you is that basically what you see in there is a fluctuation in the growth rate over time, which we have noticed. So when it's averaged out over the entire eruption, I think that's the growth rate they give, which is probably around 2 million, just under 2 cubic meters per second rather. Now, there are times when it's a bit higher. There are times when it drops a bit. So I guess last week, between the 27th and the 1st, we actually probably got that measurement where it was on one of these increases. But it fluctuates a bit within limits, but it's not really steady throughout the entire growth period. So that's a true observation. It probably would have slightly increased or appear to slightly increased over that 1 week period. But if you look at it over the entire eruption, and if you go back to some of these surveys, you would see that some of these weeks it's slightly higher than others. So yeah.
Okay, and Ms. Forbes, this one is for you. In case of an eruption in the night and rain falling heavy, how are you all going to deal with it, Ms. Forbes?
Okay, well, we're in a multi-hazard environment, and we must remember that we are in the tropics, and we have to deal with the rain, we have to deal with the lack of rain, and we have to also deal with the natural hazard of a volcanic eruption. And it depends on the rain. It depends on the type of rainfall. I'm not sure if this person is speaking about flooding or not. But if rain is falling, just as if rain is falling on a normal day, you will take the necessary precautions. The roads may be wetter, so you have to take the necessary precautions of moving people and ensuring that people still stay as safe as possible. So you will also take into consideration the whole safety aspect, time of the day, and if it is raining, you have to take those necessary precautions. Of course, it's going to be a little trickier on the northern windward part of the island if you have a lot of rain and then you have the rivers coming down. And that's why it's important for us to really pay attention to the information that we give out in terms of what you should be doing in the event of an evacuation, because definitely if the rivers come down, that can affect evacuation by land. But once we have the time, we know we have a possibility also of doing evacuation by sea. So that evacuation by sea always remain an option. It's a little easier on the leeward side, but it is also possible on the windward side. So we have to look at the different options that we can employ in event that we meet some obstacles. So those are things that when you're looking at the worst case scenario, so we prepare for the worst, those are scenarios that we're actually looking at too, because it's not just a volcano alone. I'm happy that you brought that point. It's not just a volcano alone that we're dealing with. We're also dealing with the tropics and your multi-hazard environment, where this may go into the hurricane season. We don't know. They may go into the hurricane season. And we have to take in consideration that we have other hazards that we have to plan for along with the volcano.
Okay, 2 more questions. Somebody wants to know, are there any truly predictive events prior to an eruption? And somebody else is asking, has the volcano ever really truly slipped?
Sorry, I didn't get the second question.
Has the volcano ever really truly slipped?
Slept.
Yeah.
I'll answer that first question. The last question first, rather. I mean, when we say sleeping, it means that it's not trying to kill people. Simply put, if it's not erupting, then based on our terminology, it's sleeping, because we know these systems are long-lived. The earliest rocks from Soufriere, La Soufriere here, they're probably around 1 million years old. That is a very long time. So that volcano has been around for around 1 million years. And it probably will be around for another few million years, which I don't think any of us alive now can say that. So there are times when it's, for whatever reason, not doing much, not being violent, not erupting. I mean, those periods are when we say, okay, yeah, it's sleeping, but it's not dead. And I mean, one of the telltale signs of a sleeping volcano, which is not dead, is when you've got these fumarole fields, as you had in the old dome at Soufriere. When you've got the gassing of sulfur at the surface, there's a magma chamber down there somewhere that's probably going to go off at some point in time in the future. It may not be in your lifetime, because these systems operate on timescales which are much greater than human lifetimes. So you may not ever see that system erupt, but that does not mean it's dead. It's just not ready to go off when you're around. So it's a technicality, if you like. They're sleeping, but they're not, and they're still restless because they still generate earthquakes. And for instance, an island like Dominica or even Montserrat, for example, we were having earthquakes roughly every 30 years leading up to this eruption, and that went back for about 100 years. So the people who witnessed those first earthquakes, rather, or felt them, were not around when this volcano erupted, because that was 100 years ago. So these systems are long-lived, and they do things, and then they pause for a while, and then they'll do things again. But they're still very much alive, but just resting. If you want to think that they're gathering energy or strength for the next eruption, that is one possibility. But it's just a technicality when we say they're sleeping. And as I said, simply put, they're not trying to kill people. when they're sleeping. When they're not sleeping, that is when they're erupting and trying to kill people. For want of a better word.
And I think this one is for you as well. Somebody's asking, are these gases the volcano currently emitting ignitable? And if so, can that trigger an explosive eruption?
No, they're not. They can't be ignited. What they are, they're very caustic gases, and I'm sure people would have noticed the damage done to the vegetation on the western flanks of this volcano. That's in the Larakai area, or just south of the Larakai Valley area. They're quite caustic, and they form mild acids when they combine with moisture in the air, water. And even when we were there on Monday, I was definitely, well, I wouldn't say smell, but I was sensing the presence of HCl, because if you spend enough time sniffing volcanic gases, they do different things to you. The different gases do different things to you. And the HCl was burning in the back of my throat. So I knew it was HCl, because that's the only one that does that. So I knew that was coming out. So that, I think, is what's actually doing the damage to the vegetation downslope of the volcano, because we were always getting sulfur gases before. When I came here in 2018, I measured sulfur dioxide and minor amounts of sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, and water from the old fumarole in the crater. So I know those gases were there, and people who would have gone up to the top of that volcano would not have seen that sort of devastation to the vegetation until now. And that's because you've added a new gas to the cocktail, which is the halogens, so HCl and HF. And those are what are actually doing the damage downslope. But they can't be ignited. And that's probably a good thing, because magmatic temperatures, I mean, the temperature of this lava here is a bit hotter than Montserrat. So I'm fairly certain that when we get the petrological data back from the rocks, we'll probably be getting temperatures of around 1,000 degrees Celsius for these lavas, which is quite hot. So it's probably a good thing that the gases are not combustible, because they would have ignited, as the question suggested. I think the question about prediction, that's a tricky one, because you basically have to understand how your system behaves and which parameters are useful for you to predict what your volcano is doing. And then you need to be able to see the signal for what it is. Because I can tell you, I know this from experience, that at least twice we've seen things in hindsight. It's after it happened, and we went back and looked at the record, then we said, okay, yeah, that's the signal there. So seeing it is one thing, but seeing it for what it is another thing. And seeing it for what it is means you have to have a good idea of how your system behaves and what that signal is telling you. And that is what we're trying to do. We're trying to wrap our heads around the system properly. So if it's giving us an indication that it wants to explode, we will see it for what it is. And we could tell the authorities, which would be N.E.M.O, in due time.
Okay, thank you, Doc. So, Michelle, some people here are asking about individual areas, and it's like a segue into the question I wanted to ask you to differentiate the various zones. So people are asking how you're going to handle South Rivers, is Cedar safe, those kinds of things. So maybe here's where we can talk about the zones, the different zones. And somebody was also inquiring about whether there are beds, food, etc., already in place in the event that the volcano erupts. And in these areas that people would be coming from the Sandy Bay or Richmond side of the country, so that they can be comfortable. I am not sure I heard that being mentioned as yet. And while you take that question, I'd also like the commissioner, I didn't hear it raised today in the program, but there's been a concern raised about people who may have to evacuate, for instance, north of the Dry River, who have been wondering what will happen to their personal belongings, their crops, their whatever. What plans are in place for the police to handle this very tricky area, Commissioner? But Michelle, I'll take you first on those first three things, and then Commissioner after.
Okay, we can have a look at the communities in the red zone this evening. The communities in the red zone, and we're looking at Fancy, Owia Point, Sandy Bay, London, Magum, Orange Hill, Turuma, Overland, Rabica, Langley Park, Dixon, Georgetown, Malibu, Richmond. Those are the areas in the red zone, and those are generally the communities that will be given the evacuation order first in the event that we have a potential explosive eruption. And in this context also of the activities being predominantly on the western, so the western flanks, near the western flanks where the dome is going on the western crater, we will also include the communities of Chateaubelair and Fitzhughes in the first stages of the evacuation. The aim, of course, is to get persons on the north windward side across the Dry River, across the Rabica River, down southward. Every activity, we also tell persons you must go to the shelter with enough food to last you 2 to 3 days, because we do not stockpile food in emergency shelters. If you notice now, most of our emergency shelters things that keep on hand versus things that have arrangements. Say again?
You go ahead. I thought we lost you for a moment. You go ahead.
Okay, maybe you did. So we have to space of time, but it is also an individual responsibility. We always say to persons, you take enough food to the emergency shelter with you to last 2 or 3 days until the national system kicks in. That's what we have always said, and we want to encourage persons to take that whole individual responsibility. We don't have beds, we have cots. So once the evacuation order is given, we will be taking cots to the emergency shelters also, and it depends on what time of day it happens and at what warning you have. One of the things we tried to do last year, not looking at volcanic emergencies, try to preposition cots before the start of the season, and that itself was a bit challenging because most emergency shelters do not have that storage space where we can things and for it to be safe. And I can tell you of the cots in some places, some are gone, so these are some of the challenges that we have. So we always encourage persons, if you're going to the emergency shelters, you have to take enough stuff to land. In that it will take 2 to 3 days. It most likely kicks in within a day or so, from my experience being here at N.E.M.O, providing for persons in the shelter, but also you have that individual responsibility. So we'll try our best to ensure that we have things at the shelter once persons are there, but also depends on what is happening around that time, because it's not going to be if you have a sudden eruption and you do not, the shelter man just get there. So we have to, take these things into consideration, but also you have that individual responsibility, but we are ensuring that we have our supplies that we can move to the shelters in the shortest possible time.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner.
Yeah, first of all, we are in what is labeled the pre-evacuation stage. Persons have been and continue to be educated as to what to do should an evacuation be ordered. You are required to have your valuables in such a way that you can just grab and go. I was around in 79, I was a little boy then, but I knew that the Soufriere, when it erupted, there were days when it was less explosive than others. So based on the advice from the scientists, I knew persons were able to go back and retrieve certain stuff. Notwithstanding that, the police were putting security in place as far as possible to ensure that houses and properties in the area they are secured. But at the same time, we have to be mindful that that police officers cannot help anyone. So we have to make sure that it is also safe for police officers to go back in the area and secure. What we would do would declare or would get a declaration that certain areas, the emergency areas, and persons should not be going in there. And like outside of the border, police officers would be there to ensure that persons do not go into those areas, whether for lawful means or for unlawful means. We realize that St. Vincent and Grenadines, we are surrounded by water. The Coast Guard would be integral in that preventative method as well. They would be patrolling the coast to prevent persons from entering via sea. As I said before, we are working along with the Ministry of Agriculture to help the farmers to secure their animals. I know that there will be some areas where some method where the animals would be labeled and persons can be able to identify who the animals belong to. So we are developing a multi-pronged approach towards the security issue. Education, we advising persons to make sure that they secure their houses as far as possible before they leave. We know that might not be practical, depends on the eruption, the level of the eruption at the time. But we are advising persons as far as possible to secure their properties before they leave. Where that cannot be done, we would provide security as far as best as possible, considering the safety of the police officers or the persons who are performing those duties.
Thank you, Commissioner. And as we get ready to round off the program, there are a few questions that I'm just going to pose. Do you know where the new volcano will open if it erupted? I'm not sure what that means, but I still throw it out there because it's a valid concern, I guess, for the person who sent it. Someone else wants to know if there are floodlights ready at the Chateaubriand jetty if it happens at night. And someone is saying that 3 of the satellite warehouses are within or very close to the red zone. What considerations or allocations are being made, knowing that those warehouses will not be usable for this disaster? And the final question, there won't be any more after this one. What will happen to people from the North Windward area who are doing dialysis in Georgetown and have to go to shelters and might be exposed to COVID? So I think there are questions there for all 3 of you. Yes, who wants to go first?
I can start with the satellite warehouse. Yes, we have 3 satellite warehouses in the zone that will have to be, or the zones that will have to be, the contents will have to be moved. Or we already have that contingency where the things from the warehouse at the Magum will go to Bible, those from Georgetown will go to Calicut, and those from Walsall will go to Barley, because those are the areas. And we're looking at also having additional containers where we'll have more stuff throughout the communities where we'll have persons evacuated to. So those are some of the things that as part of our contingency planning, we will have to, as part of our plan. So those are already factored in. Let me see if there's any else I need to ask.
Commissioner, maybe the one on the floodlights, I don't know.
I personally have not visited the Chateaubriand jetty, but I know that things will be put in place. There are portable floodlights that N.E.M.O have in their possession, the police also have, so that situation can be easily addressed.
Thank you. And I think the final one about the volcano, the new volcano will open if it's erupted. That's probably somebody who needs some explanation, scientific explanation there, Doc. We'll end with you on that.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. In this part of, well, in this region, I think most of the Soufriere volcanoes, that is the ones which are above land, they're well known. And there's Kickham Jenny, which is quite active. We know about that. There's Kickham Jack. I'm not sure if that has ever had an historical eruption. So yeah, I'm not sure where that's going to be, and it's probably anyone's guess. I think it has to happen first before we can say, okay, it's there. We can't really predict where volcanoes are going to emerge, especially submarine ones, because we're not really seeing the seafloor that well. So that's a difficult question to answer.
Well, thank you. I think that's a fair enough note on which to end this evening's program. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for contributing. Thank you, Director of N.E.M.O, Michelle Forbes. Thank you, Commissioner Colin John. And of course, thank you, Dr. Christopher from the UWI-SRC, who is now heading the SRC team that is here on the ground. Well, we will continue to be on the trail of La Soufriere Volcano. Just to remind you all to be safe. Have a great Wednesday evening, and we'll see you again next week, Wednesday. Good evening.